Hello everyone, welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at sentences and clauses. What is a clause? Phrases which contain a verb are called clauses. A clause always contains a subject performing a verb. For example, Jake ran. Jake is the subject, the person doing the action. Ran is the verb. It is the action being completed. So we have a subject, which is Jake, performing a verb, which is ran. So this is a clause. Phrase or clause. Examples of both. So the first one we have, Lola sang beautifully. This is an example of a clause because we have a subject, Lola, and a verb, sang. The second example, an abandoned ship, is an example of a phrase because it does not contain a subject and a verb. The third example, the white flower, is an example of a phrase. The fourth example, the boys kicked the football, is an example of a clause because it contains a subject and a verb, kicked. The next example, opposite the park, is an example of a phrase. And finally, the wind howled fiercely is an example of a clause because the subject and the verb is a part of this example. The wind being the subject and howled being the verb. So therefore that last one is an example of a clause. Now, there are two types of clauses which you need to be aware of. So the first one we have is a main clause. A main clause contains a subject performing a verb. Every sentence contains at least one main clause. The main clause is the most important idea in the sentence. It expresses a complete thought and so makes sense on its own. The clauses we looked at earlier are all examples of main clauses. So for example, Lola sang beautifully is an example of a main clause because it makes sense on its own. If you read it by itself, it makes sense. Similarly, the boys kicked the football and the wind howled fiercely are both examples of a main clause because they make sense on its own. The next type of clause we have is a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause gives extra information about the main clause. It can come before or after the main clause, but doesn't make sense on its own. So as you can see from the picture, the main clause contains the most important idea in the sentence. Okay, it will have a higher weighting. And the subordinate clause is less important. It just gives the reader a bit more detail. Subordinate clause example. Although she was clumsy, James caught the netball. So this is an example of a subordinate clause. As you can see from the picture, they're playing netball. This is the main clause. It contains a subject, James, performing a verb, caught, and it makes sense on its own. And this part here of the sentence, this is a subordinate clause. It is not a complete idea and doesn't make sense without being attached to the main clause. So this here is the subordinate clause, and this here will be the main clause. Main or subordinate clause. We have some examples to go over. So the first one reads, Emery arrived after the school bell had rung. After the school bell had rung underlined is the subordinate clause as ticked because it does not make sense on its own. Although I was terrified, okay, so if you read that in isolation, okay, that does not make sense. So for that reason, that also is an example of a subordinate clause. Okay, remember, as mentioned, a subordinate clause does not make sense on its own. The third one, It was raining, so we cancelled our picnic. So we cancelled our picnic. If you read that in isolation by itself, does it make sense? Yes, of course, it does. So therefore, the third example is an example of a main clause. The fourth one, despite it being -2 degrees Celsius outside, Frank still didn't bring his jumper to school. The underlined part here is a subordinate clause once again, despite it being -2 degrees Celsius outside. That doesn't make sense on its own, so it's a subordinate clause. The next one, on Fridays we normally go swimming, but today I forgot my kit. Today I forgot my kit is an example of a main clause because it makes sense on its own. And finally, the fox slinked through the dense undergrowth and pounced on the unsuspecting mouse. So the underlined part here is an example of a main clause because it makes sense on its own. Now, so far we have looked at two types of clause, main clauses and subordinate clauses. It is important that you are able to distinguish between these. Remember, both contain a subject performing a verb, but only main clauses make sense on their own. There is one other type of clause you should be able to identify. Please subscribe for this video because we'll be uploading this very soon. So if you want to know what this other type of clause is, please make sure you subscribe to stay updated. And to conclude today's video, we are going to look at a SAT style question. Question 19. What kind of clause is underlined in the sentence below? If they could afford to, the ancient Romans ate well. Think about it, pause the video and have a go. The correct answer is subordinate clause because it does not make sense on its own. So if you read it by itself, if they could afford to, if you just read that in isolation by itself, does it make sense? No, it doesn't. So therefore, this is an example of a subordinate clause. If you wrote that for this question, excellent, well done, amazing. If you got this answer incorrect, hopefully next time you can get the correct answer. And that takes us towards the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share Easy Education London. Please follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Easy Education London. Thank you for watching.